Hey y'all, welcome to Trying to Be Catholic. My name is Jeff. Today we're going to talk about being ambitious and doing God's will, and the way we're going to talk about it is via the avenue of discernment. So, for those of you who don't know what discernment is essentially figuring out what it is that God is calling you to do in life, whether it be something as simple as, what job or career God is calling you to, or whether it be something as big as, are you called to marriage, or are you called to being a priest, or a brother, or a nun, or single, or, a hermit and living by yourself and not contacting others. So, discernment is a pretty complicated thing. It's not all that simple. Yes, there can be simple uh, times of discernment when it comes to certain things, like, like, do I want pizza for lunch? You don't really need discernment for that, but, that's just one thing. Or on a broader scope, we should say, um, should I make changes in my life that will better me, such as eating healthy or exercising? And then, you can go from there. Those are a little more straightforward, or it can get a little bit more tricky in the sense of really broad and what is God calling you to do in your purpose in life. So I'm going to give you guys just a few quick pointers on ways that you can start trying to figure out what it is that God is calling you to. So the first place that we look oftentimes for discernment, or in the sense of the first thing that we look for when we're trying to figure out what is God's will for us, might start with ourselves, right? God created us in a certain way, and so we can kind of look at the way we were made and our desires to kind of get a glimpse into what God might be calling us to do. However, keep in mind, it is not that straightforward either, right? Because our desires are based off our emotions, and emotions can be deceiving, right? So we are not strictly looking at desire as the main factor for our discernment and what God calls us to do, because sometimes that thing that God is calling us to do, majority of the time that thing God is calling us to do is probably going to be really uncomfortable for us to do, but is ultimately going to help us. And the more we embrace that uncomfortableness, I think the easier it's going to be when it comes to doing God's will. So, once again, desire is not the main indicator, but is an indicator. But it's also based off of a couple of things. First is recognizing that our desires are led by our emotions, and our emotions can be deceiving. So, while we discern, we question our desires through all things, right? We question our desires when we are happy. We question our desires when we're sad, because we may feel one way and make one decision when we're happy, but then when we're sad, feel another way, right? If it's something that God is calling us to do, we should probably be feeling the same way about it, whether we're happy or we're sad. And so that's one of the first things to recognize, right? We don't make decisions when we're sad, right? That's not the best thing to do. And we shouldn't make decisions when we're overly joyed either, because then we might be doing too much and it can also be a bad thing, right? All things in moderation. So make decisions when you're level headed, right? It's not to say that you shouldn't consider things when you're really happy or when you're really sad, but just kind of keeping in mind that, all right, I feel like this about it now. How am I going to feel about it when I'm kind of off that emotional high or low? And if you're feeling kind of the same, then it might mean that that's a good sign. But if you're not feeling the same, well, then it means maybe you should think about it a little more. Second thing is, we should realize the state of our soul. This is another one of the most important things that are an indicator for where God would want us to be. If we're in a place that is full of sin, we surround ourselves in vices and things that harm us and don't do us good, or are solely seeking self-pleasure, then the decisions that we would want to make are not going to be in line with the way that we would if our state of our soul is moving towards virtue, right? Trying to be bettering ourselves and trying to do things for others, not solely for our own pleasure. So when we, depending on the state of our souls, St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about this a lot in his rules of discernment of good and evil spirits. It really helps us to kind of get things in perspective. If we recognize that we're moving towards a lot of sin and we keep falling into these same sins over and over and over, then, and we're not doing anything to work on it, right? We're not frequenting the sacraments, which is another huge thing for discernment. If you want to discern properly, you should be frequenting the sacraments on the regular. Frequenting the sacraments, I mean communion, confession, mass, confession, and prayer, right? Going to adoration and spending time in silence and listening to what Jesus has to say. If we are not frequenting those sacraments on a regular basis, if we're not going to mass at least once a week, if we're not going to confession at least once a month, then our decisions might be a little skewed. So it is extremely important to be in that state, right? If we're in that state where we're frequenting the sacraments and we're working towards being a better person, the decisions that we would make will more than likely be in line with what God is calling us to do, right? So these are just a few of the ways that will help us as we move forward if we want to do God's will. I've been discerning dating and discerning marriage for a year now, and I'm still discerning, right? Any day now God can say, you know what, this is where I needed you to be for this time, now I need you to be somewhere else, right? And so that's something we have to realize. Discerning is an ongoing process. He wants you to be here one day, and then the next day he might use that thing to move you somewhere else, right? And so we are always constantly discerning in life what is God's will for us. And if we stick to these things of looking at our desires and seeing how we feel about things and recognizing that if we feel the same way about it when we're feeling happy or sad, then it might be something that's good for us. And if our soul is in a good state and we're frequenting the sacraments and trying to move towards virtue, it will be that much easier to discern God's will. And so that second part, our moving towards virtue and being in a state of a soul that is in a good state to be able to determine God's will is something we're going to talk a little bit more about next week. Right? So I hope you guys like this video. I hope you guys got something out of it. If you guys have any questions, you can ask me. I have a couple of books I could recommend you on discernment, right? If you guys want to learn more about it, because St. Ignatius came up with a lot of rules, 13 for the first part, and then there's like another 10 or 11 for the second part on discerning our spirits and helping in recognizing where our spirits are to be able to make better decisions about what God wants us to do, right? So hit me up on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. I have TikTok. I don't know if I'm going to put anything on there though. And yeah, so hit me up on those platforms, and I'll catch you guys next week. See ya.